I thought I was just being paranoid about my husband until I realized I'd been collecting evidence for months. I used to think cheating announced itself. I imagined it as something obvious and dramatic, something that would knock the air out of a room and force you to face it all at once. I thought it would come with unmistakable proof. A single moment that flipped a switch in your brain and made everything clear in the worst possible way. What I didn't understand back then was that cheating, when it happens slowly and intentionally, prefers silence. It hides behind plausibility and familiarity, and it counts on love to do most of the work for it. Dune and I had been married for 7 years, together for 11. Long enough that our lives were deeply braided together in ways that felt permanent and unquestionable. We had shared apartments that still smelled like old paint and dust. We had survived career changes and cross-country moves. We had settled into a version of adulthood that was calm in the way people are calm when they believe the hard parts are behind them. Nothing about our life looked suspicious from the outside. That was part of what made it so easy to ignore the first signs. I had a framework for who Dean was, and everything I noticed that didn't quite fit into it got gently bent until it did. The first thing I remember really noticing was how tired he always seemed to be. Not physically tired in the way people get after long days, but distracted tired. Like his attention was always lagging half a step behind his body. He was present technically, but there was an absent-mindedness to him, as if part of him was elsewhere and only checking back in when necessary. I told myself this was adulthood. I told myself this was stress, ambition, and the cost of picking up extra shifts at work. I told myself I was being dramatic. Then there were the schedule changes. Dean had always been predictable in the way most people with structured jobs are predictable. His hours were consistent enough that I could plan dinners without checking. Our weekends followed a familiar rhythm where deviations felt notable simply because they were rare. Until one day they weren't. It started with the occasional late night, then more frequent ones. Then the kind of late nights that came with vague explanations that didn't quite land, but also didn't raise alarms. Everything he said sounded reasonable enough on the surface. I noticed how often he referenced the same coworker when explaining why plans had changed and how often meetings ran long in ways that were inconvenient but supposedly unavoidable. I noticed, and then I consciously decided not to linger on it. There's a particular skill you develop when you love someone deeply, and it's the ability to move your attention away from things that threaten the stability of your world. I was very good at that skill. The phone insecurity came next. Dean had never been secretive with his phone before. We didn't go through each other's devices, but there had never been a sense that they were off limits either. His phone used to live face up on counters and coffee tables, abandoned without thought, but now it was always face down. Now it was always within arm's reach, and he would grab it if I even so much as looked in its direction. Now there were moments when I'd walk into a room and feel the shift as he adjusted his posture just enough to block the screen from view. It was never dramatic or overt, just enough to register in my peripheral awareness and lodge itself somewhere in the back of my mind. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself privacy wasn't secrecy. I told myself that if I didn't have proof, I didn't have a problem. What I didn't realize was that I was already collecting proof, one harmless-looking observation at a time, without yet understanding what I was building. Looking back, what stands out the most is how long everything stayed in the realm of technically explainable. Every individual thing had a justification that made sense if you viewed it in isolation. It was only later, when I laid everything out in my mind like pieces on a table, that the shape of it became impossible to ignore. Dean started caring about his appearance in a way that felt oddly specific. Not in a general self-improvement way. Not like someone trying to be healthier or more confident, but in a way that suggested intention. New clothes appeared without comment, different from his usual style, but not so different that it seemed like a reinvention. Grooming habits shifted slightly. He paid attention to details he had never paid attention to before. If I complimented him, he accepted it casually, almost distractedly, as if my reaction wasn't the one he was anticipating. That realization sat uncomfortably with me, though. I didn't yet have language for why there were also gaps in his stories. Nothing major. Just small inconsistencies that required mental smoothing if you tried to hold on to them too tightly. Details that changed slightly depending on when they were told, and timelines that didn't always line up perfectly if you replayed them later. I Noticed myself filling in those gaps on his behalf. I supplied explanations before he had the chance. 2. I corrected my own memory instead of questioning his. It was easier that way. One evening while folding laundry, I realized I was holding a shirt I didn't remember him wearing around me. That might sound ridiculous, but after more than a decade together, there's an intimacy in knowing someone's clothes and remembering when and where they're worn. This shirt felt unfamiliar in a way that irritated me. I stood there longer than necessary, staring at it, trying to place it in a memory that wouldn't come. That was the first time I felt something close to fear. Not yet panic and not certainty. Just a subtle tightening, like my mind was brushing up against a truth. It wasn't ready to accept yet. I began paying attention in ways I hadn't before. I didn't go snooping or confronting him, just observing, watching how often his phone lit up and how quickly he reacted. Noting when he seemed unusually upbeat after being away or oddly distant when he returned. Tracking patterns without yet naming them as such. What unsettled me most was how normal everything still looked from the outside. We still lived together and still shared meals. We still talked about future plans in broad, comfortable terms. If someone had asked me then whether I thought my husband was cheating, I would have said no without hesitation. And yet beneath that certainty, something was shifting. I started to feel like I was standing in a room where the furniture had been moved just a few inches to the left, enough that I kept bumping into things I expected to be somewhere else. Nothing was overtly wrong, but nothing felt entirely right either. I didn't know it yet, but by this point, I had already crossed an invisible line. I wasn't just noticing things anymore. I was preparing myself to see something I had been avoiding for a very long time. There is a moment when you suspect something terrible, where curiosity stops being idle and becomes intentional. I crossed into that moment unceremoniously. There was no decision, no internal speech where I told myself I was going to start looking for proof. I simply stopped turning away from the things I noticed and started holding on to them instead. The difference was subtle but profound that I began paying attention to time in a way I hadn't before. I noticed how often Dean's explanations relied on vagueness, how frequently his schedule was framed in estimates rather than specifics. I realized that when people are telling the truth, they tend to anchor their stories to concrete details without thinking about it. When they're lying, they float. And Dean floated. He would leave the house with a general sense of when he might be back, never committing to anything that could be checked later. If plans changed, the explanation was always external, always outside his control, always reasonable. Enough that questioning it felt petty. I started quietly tracking those changes in my head. Not writing anything down, just noticing how often running late became a default state rather than an exception. It wasn't that I wanted him to be cheating. It was that the alternative, that my instincts were lying to me, was starting to feel less believable. The phone remained the loudest quiet thing in the room. Dean's relationship with it had become almost reflexive. Notifications pulled his attention instantly. Even when he tried to pretend they didn't, he would check it in transitional moments, in the spaces between activities and in the seconds where no one was actively watching him. And when I was watching him, he became more careful. That was what tipped something deeper into place for me. People who are merely distracted don't change their behavior based on who's in the room. People who are hiding something do. I noticed how his body language shifted when I entered a room unexpectedly. The way his shoulders adjusted, the way his grip on the phone tightened for a second before loosening, the way he would place it down screen first with practiced ease. I began to recognize those movements as rehearsed. One afternoon while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the counter. The sound cut through the house sharply. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. What mattered was the name that flashed briefly across the screen before the display went dark. It was a woman's name, a name I didn't recognize. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the blank screen. My heart pounded with a force that felt disproportionate to what I had technically seen. One name meant nothing on its own. I knew that. Coworkers existed and new contacts happened. But my body reacted before my rational mind could catch up. From that moment on, I couldn't unsee it. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I didn't suddenly become accusatory or cold. Instead, I did something that, at the time, felt safer. I watched him. I noticed how often that name appeared again. How notifications would pop up and be dismissed quickly, almost aggressively. How certain moments of happiness, small smiles, and random bursts of energy seemed to align with his phone rather than anything happening around us. The realization crept in slowly and then all at once. Dean wasn't just distracted, he was engaged somewhere else. And the most unsettling part was how skilled he had become at making sure I never felt directly excluded. He still checked in and still asked about my day. He still participated in our shared life just enough to maintain plausibility. It felt less like neglect and more like compartmentalization. I was his wife and she was his secret. And he was very careful about keeping those worlds from colliding. I used to think proof would be undeniable. I imagined messages that spelled out clearly explicit confirmations, something that left no room for interpretation. What I didn't understand was that most betrayals don't announce themselves that way. They reveal themselves through accumulation and repetition. They show up through the exhaustion of constantly explaining away what your gut already knows. Once I started looking, I couldn't stop seeing it. Dean became more protective of his privacy under the guise of boundaries. Small habits changed in ways that seemed insignificant unless you were tracking them over time. Passwords were updated and devices were kept closer. Shared spaces slowly became neutral territory rather than fully open ones. Our home began to feel divided without any physical barriers. There were nights when he came home lighter than when he had left, carrying a buoyancy that didn't match the explanation he offered for his mood. There were other nights when he returned distant and irritable, like someone who had just left a place they didn't want to be torn away from. I started to recognize the emotional whiplash for what it was. He was managing two realities. I found myself replaying past moments with new clarity. Memories started rearranging themselves as context shifted. Comments that had once felt throwaway now carried weight. Missed connections, canceled plans, and unexplained absences began lining up into something that looked less like coincidence and more like strategy. Still, I hesitated. Because even then, I didn't have what I thought of as permission to believe the worst. That permission came unexpectedly, in the form of something almost mundane. A single receipt. I was sorting through paperwork, the mindless task of organizing. Things we both ignored until they became unavoidable. Tucked between unrelated documents was a charge I didn't recognize. Not large or dramatic, just unfamiliar. It was from a restaurant Dean had never mentioned. A restaurant located nowhere. Near his office. I stared at it for a long time, my mind cycling through possible explanations before discarding them one by one. A business lunch didn't make sense. A solo meal felt unlikely given the context. The timing lined up too neatly with one of his unexplained late nights. This time I didn't push the thought away. This time I followed it. I began reconstructing his movements retroactively, matching dates and times, and cross-referencing patterns I had previously kept separate in my mind. When I placed everything side by side, the shape that emerged was undeniable. He had been lying to me. More than once. And not accidentally. He lied consistently, deliberately, and with enough forethought that it had become routine. The frustration didn't come from the betrayal itself, not yet at least. It came from realizing how much effort he had put into making sure I stayed just uncertain enough to doubt myself. How carefully he had curated confusion instead of clarity. How much of my emotional energy had been spent smoothing over inconsistencies he had introduced on purpose. I wasn't paranoid. I was being managed. And once that realization settled in, something hardened inside me. I stopped hoping to be wrong. I stopped giving him the benefit of the doubt. I stopped protecting the version of him that only existed in my memory. What I wanted now wasn't confrontation, it was certainty. And for the first time since this all began, I felt calm enough to get it. There is a strange calm that comes after denial runs out. I had expected certainty to break open all of my emotions, to feel the grief or rage or humiliation all at once. Instead, when it finally arrived, it felt clarifying. Like fog lifting. Or like realizing I had been holding my breath for months without noticing. Once I truly accepted that Dean was cheating, my focus sharpened. I stopped interpreting and started verifying. I didn't need to dig through his phone or follow him or orchestrate some dramatic trap. Dean had grown careless in the way people do when they believe they've successfully rewritten reality for someone else. He had convinced himself I wasn't looking, which meant he no longer bothered to hide as thoroughly as he once had. The proof I needed already existed. I began piecing together timelines with intention. I revisited old credit card statements, bank activity, and calendar entries. I wasn't searching for one explosive revelation. I was mapping behavior. Patterns repeated with a precision that left little room for coincidence. The same days of the week, the same windows of time, in the same locations that didn't align. With the story he told me about his work life, the evidence didn't scream. It stacked. What finally pushed it past doubt was realizing that this wasn't new. This wasn't a recent mistake or a moment of weakness or a temporary lapse in judgment. This was something that had been happening long enough to have a rhythm, long enough to have infrastructure, long enough that he had built parts of his life around it. Dean hadn't stumbled into an affair. He became a master of maintaining one. That realization carried a different kind of weight. It reframed everything I had experienced over the last several months. The distance, the defensiveness, the calculated ambiguity, none of it was accidental. It was the byproduct of sustained deception, and worse than that, it meant he had made active choices every single day to protect that deception rather than our marriage. I found confirmation in places I hadn't expected. A shared cloud account showed gaps in location data that aligned too cleanly with his late nights. A synced calendar revealed events that had been renamed or duplicated, time blocked off in ways that no longer made sense when viewed honestly. An email receipt auto-forwarded to a folder he likely forgot existed filled in the final pieces. There it was. It wasn't graphic or explicit. Just undeniable. The proof didn't hurt the way I thought it would. What hurt was how boring it was. How easily his life divided itself into two clean columns. What he let me see and what he carefully kept separate. That was the moment something fundamental shifted inside me. I stopped wanting explanations or apologies. I stopped wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Because nothing I could have changed would have altered the fact that Dean was capable of this level of sustained dishonesty. And nothing he could say would change the fact that he had chosen it over and over again. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I took my time. I gathered what I needed, quietly and thoroughly. I documented. I backed things up. I thought about logistics rather than emotions. I considered my future instead of trying to salvage the past. Dean continued playing his role, unaware that the performance was over. That was the most frustrating part in a strange way, watching him move through our shared life with confidence. Believing his version of events was holding. Watching him trust that my silence meant ignorance rather than resolve. I waited longer than I needed to before confronting Dean, not because I was afraid and not because I was hoping something would change, but because I wanted to be certain of who I was walking into that moment as. I didn't want to confront him while I was still raw or searching for reassurance. I wanted to do it once I no longer needed anything from him at all. That shift changed everything. By the time I spoke up, I wasn't asking questions. I was delivering information. The night I chose was unremarkable on purpose. Just an ordinary evening, the kind that had once made up the backbone of our life together. That kind of normalcy mattered because I wanted him to understand that this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a reckoning. I told him I knew he was cheating. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't soften it with qualifiers or uncertainty. I stated it plainly, the way you state a fact that no longer requires validation. The silence that followed was immediate and revealing. Dean froze in a way I had never seen before. Not startled, but suspended, like someone whose mental script had just been erased mid-scene. He didn't respond right away because he was recalculating, scanning for the angle he usually used to regain control. When he finally did react, it wasn't remorse, it was panic. He tried denial first, but it was weak, like a habit he hadn't yet realized was useless. When I didn't engage, didn't argue, and didn't provide details he could counter, the denial collapsed under its own weight. That was when the explanations started. He framed it as complicated, as something that hadn't meant anything, as something that existed in a separate emotional universe from our marriage. He spoke as if intention mattered more than impact, as if secrecy somehow diluted responsibility. What struck me most was how carefully he avoided specifics because specifics would have required honesty. I let him talk. Not because I was listening for answers, but because I was watching something unravel in real time. The confidence he had carried for months, the quiet assurance that he was managing me, that I was unaware or unwilling to see, drained away sentence by sentence. When I finally spoke again, I didn't contradict him, I corrected him. I told him how long it had been going on. I told him I knew the days, the locations, the lies he reused because he assumed I wasn't tracking them. I didn't present evidence physically. I didn't need to. The look on his face told me everything. He hadn't just been caught, he had been studied. That realization hit him harder than anger ever could have. His posture shifted, his certainty fractured, and for the first time since this all began, he looked genuinely exposed. He asked how long I had known, and I told him the truth. Long enough to stop loving him. That was the moment the confrontation became something else entirely. He tried to backtrack then, to reframe the past and suggest we could still salvage something if we handled it carefully. He spoke about history and about how much we had invested in each other. What he didn't speak about was accountability, and that told me everything I needed to know. I told him I wasn't interested in repairing something that had only survived because I had been kept in the dark. I told him that trust wasn't something you negotiate back once it's been dismantled deliberately. I told him that what hurt the most wasn't the affair itself. It was the months of manipulation, the calculated confusion, the intentional gaslighting, and the way he had let me doubt my own instincts while he benefited from my silence. That was when his composure finally cracked. Not because he understood my pain, but because he understood the consequences. He asked what I wanted, and I told him what was going to happen. I told him I was leaving. I told him I had already taken steps to protect myself legally and financially. I told him I had documented what I needed and that I would not be persuaded, guilted, or rushed into anything for his comfort. The confrontation ended without resolution, without reconciliation, and without the dramatic closure stories like this are supposed to have. And yet it was the most definitive moment of my life. I walked away knowing the truth, not just about what he had done, but about who he was when given the opportunity to choose honesty over convenience. I didn't leave angry, I left clear. Dean lost control of the narrative he had been carefully constructing for months, and I reclaimed mine.